Hello, everyone. Today I will do a live for you guys. Thanks for joining me. Just sharing my screen here. All right, here we go. Well, thanks for joining me, everyone. I really appreciate that. Just gonna check if you guys can see me. Yeah, seems like you do. So today I will present to you about autism prevalence. This is my first live out of the lives that I'm gonna be doing here. My name is Alex. So thank you for joining me today. So I have two boys on the spectrum, and many of my friends right now on Facebook, they have children on the spectrum. And there is a point where you look at the world holistically after the diagnosis, and the initial kind of, natural response you have to the diagnosis, and wonder how many more people like me are out there, how many children are being diagnosed every year, like what's the population looks like, what's the scale of that thing, and kind of really questioning uh, why you feel alone. Maybe lots of us do, and really trying to connect with your tribe, within your community. And so if you envision yourself as part of this person that kind of, if you sit there and kind of look at the world holistically, I think the value that this presentation will provide to you is exactly that, to understand the numbers associated, what exactly we're talking about, and how those numbers are coming to life. What are the real numbers associated with autism diagnostics? So today we have about 1 in 54 8-year-old children identified with ASD, and this is based on the 2016 numbers. ADDM network, they do every 4 years evaluation. I will talk a little bit more about this in my presentation. And there are several ways where we look at the diagnosis. So you would say 1 in 54 sometimes. This number is probably going to increase this year when they do every 4 years. So this number is going to increase probably to 1 in 50, maybe more, to 2%. But if we were to divide 1 in 54, we get about 1.85%. And if you multiply this number by 10, you get about 18.5 children out of 1,000. So that's kind of the ratio, 18.5 out of 1,000. So the scientific community would look at those numbers that way. They would say, hey, you have 30 people out of 1,000 on the autistic spectrum. So that's how they will evaluate that. And that's kind of the numbers you're going to be seeing. But those are the same numbers as saying like 1 in 54, 1 in 50, or whatever it is. So if we establish that in 2016, basically, and the reason why they take the 8-year-old children population is because they have to fix some kind of age parameter, because you can't really sample like from 9-year-old, 10-year-old. You need to kind of level a certain sample and say, this is a representative population, and that's how many children out of that population are on the autistic spectrum, which happened to be 1.85% back in 2016. So if you take the US population today, so I'm Canadian, I'm from Canada, but a lot of my friends are from US, and I'll just use US numbers today for you guys. 328 million people, 200 million people, multiplied by 1.85, you essentially get 6 million ASD in US only. So unless my math is wrong, and I invite everyone to comment if you see those numbers otherwise. And this essentially suggests that we have a population, ASD population, that is as big as population or comparable to Wyoming, Vermont, Alaska, North Dakota, South Dakota, Delaware, and Montana combined. It's also comparable to Wisconsin, population of Wisconsin. It's also comparable to population of Colorado, Minnesota, Maryland. And this is really interesting because as a father to two boys on the autistic spectrum, when your kids get diagnosed, you feel somewhat alone because often you don't know who the people that have it too, or maybe they're your neighbors, but you don't know who they are. And yet on the bigger scale, this number is fairly big. It's just around us, it's very hard if it's like 1 in 54, so 1 in 54 neighbors, very hard to kind of estimate that your family is, has this diagnosis. So that's why maybe people feel alone. But within the social community on Facebook, on Instagram, on YouTube, there's all those connections that they can place. And those connections are really helping people to get a better idea about their situation. And like I said, we're talking about 6 million people in US only. So in Canada, that will be 600,000 people because the population is 10th of the overall population of the US. So how are those numbers being derived? Essentially, the Autism and Development Disabilities Monitoring Network, ADDM, has 11 sites in the United States in 2016. And I think this is the most kind of advanced, I guess, network of measuring how many people have autism. And the idea to measure that would be to provide the services that we all know that lacking in certain areas and make sure the government understands the needs for the communities. And as you can see, basically those 11 areas, they're kind of random in the nature. And today I will talk a little bit more in detail about Arkansas and Arizona. But those are the Autism Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. Essentially, that's the map. So what's the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder children? As we said before, 18.5, that's the average. That's what you see here on the graph. Out of 1,000 children, ages 8 years old, based on 2016 study that was conducted. And as you can see, this number actually varies from state to state based on the ADDM site. So today we'll cover in detail about Arkansas and Arizona. But you can see like Colorado has about close to 15 children out of 1,000, all the way up to New Jersey that has over 30. So 30 in 1,000, 3%. 3%, which is higher than the 1.85% that is the average. And in my next slides, I will be covering to why that's happening, which is really interesting. That's a big percentage. What this essentially says is that you have a child. Like, remember, guys, when we were little, we used to go to school, and there'll be, let's say, 30 kids in the class. So essentially, there'll be at least one child that has autism or autistic child in your classroom in New Jersey. And North Carolina is very close to that number, which is really interesting. So this is kind of the study for 2016. And in 2020, we will see the updated version of that. We will see what the actual numbers for this year. But because this network takes a very long time to compile those numbers because of the privacy and the complexity of those networks, we get the results maybe like months and years later. So let's dive into the details about Arizona and Arkansas. I'll just check that my presentation is still working. Seems like it is. So this table, and I can see that you guys can see it well, is the prevalence for autism spectrum disorder among children ages 8 by overall and by sex, so males and females within the ADDM network. So we essentially have two states here. In my next slides, as I mentioned, I will cover other sites in more detail. And so when it comes to Arizona, so if I have people here from Arizona, please comment on what you think about this data, what if you think it's real, if it's not real, what are your thoughts? Maybe the services are being impacted to the positive or to the negative. So if you're from Arizona, let me know. If you're from Arkansas, let me know as well. So essentially, part of one county in metropolitan Phoenix was looked at the population to get, which is, in my opinion, I don't know how you guys feel about that, but it doesn't feel like a lot. So that county, if I go back, is essentially like at the bottom there in the corner. So in Arizona there. So that's the area in the metropolitan Phoenix. And the total population looked at was 17,656 kids, ages 8, and about 282 of those children were seen as having ASD. So the prevalence in this case was basically 282 divided by 17,656, which is 16. So 16 children in 1,000. And that 95 confidence interval that you see here is essentially because it's not really being disclosed by parents, it's not being disclosed by professionals because of the privacy rules. They have a confidence interval that says, well, it's 16, but it could also be like 14.2 to 17.9, which is closer to kind of US average number. When it comes to males and female ratio, the male to female prevalence ratio is about 4.2. What this essentially means that you have 4 boys and 1 girl diagnosed with autism out of those 282 children. And the way to look at the male to female ratio is essentially you take the 25.4 kids, you divide it by 2, you take the 6, you divide it by 2, and you end up with basically 16 within that confidence interval. So in Arizona, you essentially have 4 boys with autism, autistic boys, and 1 girl. That's kind of the ratio. The next state that we'll cover is Arkansas. Arkansas, what's really fascinating about Arkansas is that they looked at all 75 counties in Arkansas. So let's go back to the map. So you can see the map of Arkansas. It's really full of those ADDM networks. So they basically, it's a fairly smallly populated state. They basically like went in and evaluated the entire state. And that creates a really cool opportunity to further understand the population even in Arizona, and soon I will show you why. So basically, they end up with 8-year-olds, and they say there's like 40,225 8-year-olds in Arkansas, and 606 of them are on the autistic spectrum. So the prevalence, if you divide 606 by 40,225, you essentially get 1.5%, which is 15.1 out of 1,000. So that's your prevalence for autism spectrum in Arkansas. The male to female ratio, again, is about 4.5. It's slightly higher than in Arizona. So 4.5 boys out of, and 1 girl. So, but if you multiply the 2 numbers, what this essentially means is that there's like 9 boys and 2 girls on the spectrum. So that's kind of the comparable. But what Arkansas numbers actually give us is another insight, because they did the overall population for 8-year-olds. We can derive now learnings to better understand Arizona and further states that we will be looking at in my next slides. Because Arkansas population is 3,039,000, so 3 million essentially people, and 40,225 8-year-olds, and 100% of them were evaluated. This essentially means that if we divide 40,000 by 3 million, we get 1.32%, which is the 8-year-old population in US. And if you take that number and divide 100 by that number, you essentially get an average lifetime, which is 75.5 years in Arkansas. Now, this number, I guess, is somewhat close to the lifespan for a human in US, which is like 78 years or something like that, maybe 77, 79 years. So 75.5 in Arkansas, but that also assumes kind of that all people, like the same amount of population is at every age. So if you're like 22-year-old, you're the same population as like 40,000 people. If you're like 75-year-old, again, 40,000. So that's not like exact science, but at least it's kind of somewhat indicative of kind of how to look at Arizona. So if we use the same analogy for Arizona, we know the population is like over double than Arkansas. So essentially you have like 7.3 million people living in Arizona. And if we divide that by 75 years, we get about 97 basically children, ages 8-year-old population. So I don't know, I just use this kind of as a shortcut. Maybe this number kind of deviates. Maybe it's 100,000, maybe it's like 90,000, but I figured kind of as a representative kind of number to better understand the sample that was taken in Arizona. So if we look 8-year-old population in Arizona, we essentially see that only 17,656 kids were looked at out of that 97,000. So that's about 18% of that population, which is, they basically didn't look at 82% of the population. And the prevalence was 16%. So that 16% could be maybe 18% or maybe 16 in 1,000, so 1.6%, or it could be closer to 2% if the other 82% of the children were looked at. But they were not looked at because they just picked, as I mentioned here on the map, very specific tracking areas. So that's kind of the best advancement that they could make in measuring those parameters to provide more services for the kids. And this is essentially it. This is what I wanted to share. So the number for Arizona is 16 with, so 16 in 1,000 essentially. For Arkansas is about 15, and the US average is about 18.5 in 1,000. And in my next lives, we will be talking about further states. If you want to see your state and better understand the numbers in your state, please leave a comment on this live. I will be very happy to share it in my next communication with you guys. Also, please, I'm acknowledging here the surveillance summary for the ADDM network on how this in early autism developmental disabilities 2016 report. And a couple of things here. Please join Facebook group Autism Stories. That's kind of where I operate. I share some more stuff over there. So I would love to see you guys in that group. Let me know your thoughts about this presentation. What do you guys think? Yeah, I'm looking forward to really getting to know everyone, and let me know the feedback for this live and if you liked it. So that would be it, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.